Distinguished delegates at COP26 in Sharm el-Sheikh and attendees worldwide, welcome to our side event, bringing nature-based climate action to cities in challenging times. My name is Boran, Professor of Environmental Governance and Public Policy at York University in Canada. I lead the Synergies of Planetary Health Research Initiative at the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. I also serve as the Associate Director of CFAL York, a leadership training and capacity building hub affiliated with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, UNITAR, at York University. Today is Biodiversity Day here at COP27, and we have a nature-focused climate action side event for you. Our panelists will identify priorities for green, climate-resilient, and healthy cities. This side event is brought to you through a partnership between the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS, the Zoological Society of London, ZSL, the Society for Wildlife Research and Environmental Education, SPVS, based in Brazil, Boticário Group Foundation, also based in Brazil, and York University in Canada, with its Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research, and CFAL York. I have now the distinct pleasure to present Dr. Sander Chan. Sander, you are Assistant Professor at Radboud University and Associate Researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. And together with me, you are a lead partner and co-organizer of this side event. Thank you for agreeing to moderate this session. So then, without further ado, let's get started. Sander, I have the pleasure to give you the floor. Over to you.
Thank you, and welcome here at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. So how can we unleash the power of nature to make our cities green, resilient, and healthy? We have an exciting panel today to discuss this with you, to discuss the linkages between nature and climate, and how these relate to planetary health, cooperation across borders, rewilding, rights, and local protection in and around cities. This event will be live streamed through YouTube, so we also welcome viewers around the world who are joining us on the live stream. Wherever you are, you can take part in this discussion. You can pose your comments and questions through Twitter and also Mastodon using the hashtag NCGroundswell, which stands for Groundswell for Nature and Climate Action for Planetary Health. You will see the hashtag now on the screen. Now it is my honor to introduce our first panelist, Professor James Orbinski. James, you are a medical doctor with over 30 years of humanitarian experience in war, famine, epidemic disease, genocide, and circumstances of political fragility. And in 1999, as president of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, you accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. So now you are professor and inaugural director of Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research at York University in Canada, which focuses on global health, humanitarianism, planetary health, and global health foresighting. So I'm sure you're in a great position to tell us about planetary health and inspire us to action.
Well, thank you very much, Sander, for a very kind introduction. We're talking about bringing nature-based solutions into cities in challenging times. And I'd like to give some background to the panel. And for those who are unfamiliar, to introduce the concept of planetary health. Global warming, or what I prefer to call global boiling, is indeed the major challenge of our times. And I very much believe that nature-based solutions are on the right path forward, particularly if they're framed within a vision of planetary health. We'll hear about several very practical initiatives from other panelists, but I just would like to call our attention to Somalia today. As we speak, literally hundreds of thousands of people are starving in a nightmare of famine and despair. 41% of 16 million people will face acute food insecurity between today and December 31st. This is one of there are hundreds of centers of displacement around the small city of Baidoa, which is a city that I worked in the famine of 1992-93. During that time, more than 400,000 people died of famine in Somalia. And in 2011, another 260,000 people died of famine in Somalia. Now, meteorologic analysis suggests very strongly that drought will be a recurrent reality as global warming and climate change accelerate. The human famine in Somalia is an outcome amplified by drought, an extreme weather event that is a consequence of human-induced global warming. I could just as easily talk about people in Malawi or India or South America. Today, more than 800 million people in 43 countries around the world live with food insecurity or on the precipice of famine-like conditions and go to bed hungry every single night. With increasing climate and political instability, these numbers are expected to worsen. Now, Somalis are a small fraction of the more than 300 million people who need humanitarian assistance today. This is more than at any time since World War II. And that global number is growing every day and far outstrips the capacities of humanitarian organizations to assist them. Indeed, actual per capita humanitarian assistance relative to growing need is actually falling. It's not increasing. We fundamentally need to rethink and redesign our approach to humanitarian assistance. Now, it goes without saying that we must understand the causes and conditions created by global warming in order to meaningfully address them. Global warming is occurring in a complex ecology that includes us and is caused by us. Indeed, this is the age of the Anthropocene and of the sixth great extinction. Global warming amplifies other crises and has cascade effects, which include food insecurity, infectious diseases, extreme weather events, rising sea levels and salinization, failure of supply and infrastructure systems at local, regional, and global scales, migration, accelerated displacement, social upheaval, migration, and war. We're talking about nature-based solutions in cities. Globally, we are now, as of yesterday, 8 billion people on the planet, and we are still growing by 1 billion people every 13 years. The majority of us today, 56% of us, now live in cities. Rural to urban migration is now so great that 66% of us will live in cities by 2050, or at least 1 billion people more will be in cities in 2050 than there are today. Of these people, half to 3/4 will live not in the relatively well-managed municipalities of, for example, most capital cities with established building codes and infrastructure services, but like Kibera, the slum Kibera outside the city of Nairobi, the majority of people will live in informal slums, in barrios and squatter settlements that are already the defining feature of most cities today globally. I'd like to highlight that 58% of refugees today now live in cities, not in refugee camps. And the majority of humanitarian needs are actually now in cities. Nature-based solutions must include these people who are the most vulnerable among us. Now, I'm definitely preaching to the converted when I say the idea that we are separate from or above nature, that we have dominion over it, and that nature is endlessly abundant, that this is a dangerous relic of an age of arrogance and ignorance. We are part of nature. We depend on ecological systems to sustain us. This is a dependent, not a symbiotic, and not even an interdependent relationship. It is absolutely dependent. Human civilization depends on our natural biosphere. Our natural biosphere does not depend on human civilization. Planetary health as a concept is an explicit recognition of this, and explicitly recognizes that the health of human civilization is dependent on the health of natural systems. Now, Margaret Mead, the great anthropologist, was asked by a student what, in her opinion, was the first evidence of civilization among Homo sapiens. Now, most expected her to answer with a reference to early clay pots or to hunting tools. Instead, she talked about discovering a 15,000-year-old human femur or leg bone that had evidence of a severe but well-healed fracture. It indicated to her that others had carried the injured to safety, had cared and fed and nurtured him or her, and had supported them as they returned to some function, perhaps disabled, within the group. Now, I want to put it to you that there are no viable solutions within nature-based solutions that are not life-centered in design, within its sustaining ecology for all life, including human life. If we do not consider the most vulnerable among us today in our proposed solutions, including nature-based solutions, we are very, very unlikely to consider them tomorrow. We are part of this beautiful and wounded biosphere, including the most vulnerable among us. Let me close by saying that we cannot negotiate with the melting point of ice. The famine in Somalia is but one example of the consequences we are now facing and will face on a much wider scale. There is no escape from this. There's no bubble retreat. It is truly reality as it is. If we meet greenhouse gas emission targets according to existing policies and trajectories, the likely scenario is that we will be living on our own planet that is 2.8 to 3.2 degrees warmer than it was at the end of the last century. This is the likely scenario. This portends vast and what are now fully imaginable global social upheavals over the next 70 years, to which we will adapt one way or another, with all of us or with some of us. A planetary health for both human civilization and the biosphere on which it depends for all life and for all of us, including the most vulnerable, is a pathway to a sustainable global health. I very much look forward to listening to our other panelists and to the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thank you for reminding us that climate action must be about expanding life, that we need to meet humanitarian disaster with humanitarian systems that reflect our dependency on natural systems. And Andrew Deneault, my colleague, he's going to further think about parts of this system, cross-border cooperation that we need to further nature and climate cooperation and action. Together, Andrew and I have built the Nature and Climate Cooperative Initiatives databases, which at the moment track over 600 large-scale transnational initiatives all major initiatives that have been launched at climate conferences such as these since 2014. Andrew is a researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. He has a background in international cooperation, urban development, and development economics. Andrew, what trends do we see in nature-based climate action among transnational and non-state actors?
Thanks very much, Sander. It's a pleasure to be here on this distinguished panel. So there's a gap between government commitments for climate, nature, and health, and what we're actually seeing on the ground. These gaps can be filled through cross-border collaborations between cities, regions, businesses, and civil society organizations. This is what we call transnational action. One example is Nature for Climate, which disseminates knowledge and drives investment and action towards nature-based solutions around the globe. Currently, they aggregate 200 projects in 100 countries. Another is Healthcare Without Harm, which aims to operationalize climate solutions in hospitals, which on a per square meter basis use more energy than office buildings. In our research, we see the promises of transnational action: a large mobilization of actors, the ability to achieve goals that solve problems, and a broad contribution to sustainable development, particularly in developing countries. However, based on current findings, these promises are not being fulfilled. How do we do this? We've developed the Nature-Based Climate Cooperative Initiatives Database, or NCID, to understand the landscape and track the progress of cooperative action for nature and climate. The database samples transnational nature-based climate initiatives, including those launched at major climate summits between 2014 and 2021. It gathers data on actors, organizational characteristics, target setting, functions, as well as a proxy for performance, which we call function output fit. That we can explain later if there's time. Some findings from the emerging landscape of transnational nature-based climate action. First, the mobilization of actors. We do see a surge, as you can see, from 2013 to 2015 in these initiatives. However, since 2019, preliminary research suggests a worrying trend. And as we can see, there's less initiatives that have been launched in recent years. As well, many have concluded their activities as of 2021. Preliminary research suggests that many initiatives that have been launched in the past few years only exist in their launch documents. We find no reports, no outputs, no websites, and based on what we know, this translates into no action. Promise 2, the ability to achieve goals. We've assessed transnational nature-based initiatives using a methodology which tracks the outputs they produce as it links to the functions, the way they describe themselves. While our analysis shows a growing share of high-performing initiatives, this is the dark green segment on the bottom, we see the share of medium-high performance has decreased. We can't fully explain this trend. Perhaps the negative impacts are pandemic-related. The concern is, although we see 20% of initiatives in this chart possess a high likelihood of achieving their goals, 80% have a medium, low, or null likelihood of achieving their goals. Promise 3, broad contributions to sustainable development and global climate action in the South. In this chart, the light green are OECD countries, actors from OECD countries and implementations in these countries. The dark blue are the Global South or non-OECD countries. We find that across these 98 or so initiatives, most funders, leaders, and participants are coming from OECD countries. And a little more than half of the implementation is occurring in Global South countries. This raises questions as to the role played by the South in activities that are implemented where they live and work, and asks the question whether the benefits are accruing to the people and communities there. Finally, as COP27 comes to a close in Egypt, and the Biodiversity COP15 begins in Montreal, Canada, from 7 to 19 December, we call for a well-designed climate and biodiversity action agenda that focus on accountability and inclusivity. This applies to climate mitigation and countries' NDCs, adaptation and country NAPs, as well as commitments to nature and health, and the 2023 global stocktake. In the slide, we see the mobilization of actors. What we need to drive these initiatives toward are setting standards, tracking progress, and applying support or pressure to their activities. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing these very important but also very sobering trends. You talked about the promise of growing engagement. You talked about the promise of effective action and the promise of benefits for the most vulnerable countries and communities. But at the moment, we see that transnational action that has been presented with so much pomp at conferences like these actually are failing us largely at the moment. And that is something we should definitely act on. Now that we have discussed planetary health and cross-border cooperation as important dimensions of nature-based climate action, we also have to ask ourselves, how does nature-based climate action actually look like in the context of cities? I'm very glad that we have Dr. Natalie Pettorelli joining us per video. And Natalie is a conservation scientist, senior conservation scientist at the Zoological Society of London. Her work focuses on assessing, predicting, and mitigating the impacts of global environmental change on biodiversity and ecosystem services. She also co-chairs the IUCN Rewilding work group. So I would find it hard to think of anyone else who would be better at discussing rewilding with us as a nature-based climate action in the context of cities.
Hello, and thank you for joining me to talk about rewilding our cities and how it could bolster urban climate resilience. Now, the first question I'm sure some of you may have is, what's rewilding? Rewilding is a rapidly developing concept in ecosystem management, which is broadly understood as a conservation approach that supports the reinstatement of natural processes in functionally degraded ecosystems, with the idea to put them on a trajectory to being more ecologically complex and less subjected to human intervention, which means minimal to no ongoing management in the long term. How does that work in cities? Well, rewilding aims to move ecosystem on a continuum of human modification, transitioning them towards a state of increased ecological complexity and reduced human intervention. Now, that can be applied to all ecosystems, including urban ones. Why would you do it when, well, rewilding and urban rewilding can really help urban ecosystem recover multiple ecological processes interaction, thereby boosting a number of ecosystem function and ecosystem services delivery, while overall increasing the ecosystem's resilience. There's a number of benefits here for urban rewilding. Importantly, benefits when it comes to climate mitigation, but mostly adaptation. For example, urban rewilding can lead to increasing the rate of water infiltration, slowing water flow, and reducing the risk of riverbank collapse and erosion, all very pertinent when you're faced with increased risk of flooding. It can also help cool cities and reduce the enhanced impact of air pollution during heat wave. But that's not all. Urban rewilding can also contribute to wildlife recovery, reduce the environmental management cost, improve human health and well-being, as well as increasing the economic activity and wealth. Now, there will be a number of challenges associated with urban rewilding, whether it's problematic invasive alien species, species introduction by the public, disease, divestment of resources from existing traditional conservation sites, increased human-wildlife conflict, green gentrification, or challenging policy context and complex legal and financing structure. Now, all of that can be managed by using some key steps to support the implementation of urban rewilding projects. Most importantly, to adopt a landscape view, so acknowledging that a rewilding project will not be all over the cities, but in very specific place, and think about how that will connect with other nature recovery projects and how that increase, for example, connectivity. Importantly, ensuring that residents are on board, engaged, and informed. Following the science, we have a lot of experience now with nature recovery. All of that needs to be used to inform the nature recovery and urban rewilding in cities. Getting the monitoring right, really important, so that you can detect problems early and manage them before they become really big, as well as learning from existing projects and building partnerships so that there is constant information flow and exchange of tips. So this is the end of my presentation. I have three important conclusions for you. One, that urban nature is in dire need of support and respect because it is supporting the health and well-being of more than half of the human population in the world. Second, nature recovery in cities to boost cities' resilience to climate change is really a no-brainer. We should be doing this. We need to do this more. Finally, urban rewilding provides an incredible opportunity to engage residents with nature, including through monitoring and stewardship processes, which is really important when faced with a biodiversity crisis, getting people on board with conservation, getting them connected with nature. Thank you very much. If you have any question, please do reach out, and please do, if you want to learn more and read more, please download our report, which is entitled Rewilding Our Cities, published by the Zoological Society of London and freely available on the web. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Natalie. I'm sure that you are following us right now on the live stream. May I remind you that you can be part of this discussion joining us online and using the hashtag NCGroundswell. Natalie talked about the links between nature, climate and health through rewilding, and that it is really a no-brainer to do it, also considering that half of the population lives in cities. Also with us is Bethan Laughlin, who is a colleague of Natalie's and senior policy specialist at the Zoological Society of London. Her work, your work, focuses on guiding, developing and implementing solutions to biodiversity and the climate crisis through protecting, restoring and renewing nature. We will have the opportunity to further discuss with you as we move into the discussion bit of the panel. Thank you for being with us. But now we will first move on to Deborah Delgado. And Deborah is an associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and she specializes in environmental and climate policies. She has led research teams on indigenous movements, human rights, natural resource management, and gender on the ground in the Amazon regions of Bolivia and Peru. And she has been also following the UNFCCC for about 10 years now. Yeah. Deborah, can you share with us about why nature-based climate action in cities needs to be rights-based?
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you in this amazing panel to bring you this time to the Amazon Basin, an area that we rarely think as an urban area, but it's actually rapidly urbanizing. So I'm just showing you the map of the biggest basins in Panamazonia. And most of my examples will come from the Putumayo-Iza region, which is on the north of the left north of the map, from my point of view, at the side of Napo. So it's about 1.7% of the total water resources that the Amazon Basin has. But it's a very interesting context to analyze what bring us together, nature-based solutions and urbanization in the world. So next. So these are pictures of two different cities that are there. One is Tabatinga and the other one is Santo Antonio do Iza. Both are in Brazil, but they are on the frontier, the triple frontier with Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. And this is a very particular area because it's growing really fast, and it's a place of moving of commodities, both legal and illegal commodities go through this area. And on the right-hand side, you see, well, on the one that has the road, you see the little town of Santo Antonio de Iza that actually has 6 pumps on its area, and it has a very low population that is actually stable on the ground. So we are encountering a different urbanization that has its own characteristics in the Amazon Basin, which these kind of pictures, I wanted to take you there because it's way more, it's like a flux. It uses the rivers, it is urban, it uses material culture elements of an urban society, which is very polluting, but it's very fluid in its way of occupying this space. And 80% of the people living in the Amazon Basin still depend on fisheries for their consumption of proteins. So food insecurity, or worse, famine and bad quality water are very, very pressing issues. So to speak about rights, I'm bringing you pictures of the work we just did last week, bringing together the people that are, the institutions that are actually in charge of asserting the rights of indigenous peoples, but also local communities. And this is like a partnership that has local territorial organizations that are super diverse to actually enhance the right-based approach to services, but mainly to nature-based solutions that doesn't displace them, that acknowledge that their societies are changing, and they use urban spaces as well as rural ones. So next one. So here's somebody from FUNAI explaining the mechanisms that they have available for Kukama people that are actually in a process of revitalization their culture. So something that we learned during this work is that collective human rights are essential, but information has to be accessible. It's not only doing institutions arrangements, but actually approaching the people that have to work together on a very territorial level. And this is very impactful. Alliances to coordinate among local communities and communities that have been stigmatized, such as, for example, agricultural communities that do deforest. It's very important to change some behavior. So next, please. Because, can we change the one? Yes. Because we're actually speaking about collective human rights, of people that have been stigmatized, and many times they have been deprived of rights. So rights can particularly in places going through deep changes related to urbanization, should be always rethinked. So I wanted to leave you with an example. This is, you can see a burial site of Caixana people in this Santo Antonio do Isa little urban space. And on the side of it, like right in front of this burial site, actually on the burial site, you have an energy plant that didn't recognize that there was a burial site on the ground, although this burial site is registered. So respecting cultural rights on urban spaces, it's such an important element that sometimes we associate with rural areas, but they are actually urban, and they are key to revitalize some practices that we may associate with the last presentation, with rewilding. So going back to eat local food and the way we do the local food there. So with low energy and very high nutrient elements. So I hope this was insightful, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Absolutely, Deborah, it was insightful, and it's also maybe a surprising lens for a lot of people to think of Amazonia as, like, look at it from a lens of urbanization, right, which is very important. And I really appreciate the fact that you talk about how the humanitarian systems that James talked about should also reflect cultural and collective rights, and too often these have been trampled upon, and unfortunately also in the name of climate action. So that is not real climate action, I would say. Thank you. So now we move on to Ricardo. Sorry. Am I? Okay. Well, in the meantime, if you are on Mastodon or Twitter and follow this online, use the hashtag #NCGroundswell to comment and to ask questions. I'm just checking now whether we're going to Ricardo or, yeah, okay. Thank you. So now we go to Ricardo Borges, and Ricardo is a forest engineer who works on local development through nature conservation. He's coordinator of the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve Initiative at the Wildlife Research and Environmental Education Society, SPVS, a Brazilian non-profit organization. And SPVS applies best practices of conservation through innovative initiatives and through societal engagement. Ricardo.
Brazil is a country of continental dimensions. It has two amazing tropical forests. One of them is the well-known Amazon forest, and the other one is the Atlantic forest that stretches along the coast of the country, and it's home to over 70% of Brazilians. With an amazing variety of species, but only 7% left of well-preserved remnants, this is one of the main biodiversity hotspots in the world. However, there are still good news. The Atlantic Forest Great Reserve is the largest well-preserved remnant of this biome. Located between 3 states, it has one of the highest densities of protected areas in the whole country. This forest is shared by 60 municipalities that depend on it for both their well-being and economy. This includes several traditional communities such as the Guaranis, the Caiçaras and the Quilombolas, holders of a rich cultural heritage and strong traditions. We see here a clear opportunity for economic growth and social development through preserved nature, valued local culture, and structured protected areas. In a post-COVID world, we were forced to review many of our activities. All efforts are focused on ensuring people's well-being and income opportunities while preserving the environment. This is made possible through a restorative economy with focus on businesses with a positive social and environmental impact. Many people in this territory can benefit, especially young people who need opportunities to stay in their homeland and not be forced to leave to larger cities. Therefore, the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve is one of the ways of making this potential a reality. And we cannot do this work alone. All efforts are carried out together through a voluntary network that engages people towards a common goal. There are already hundreds of associate members who meet regularly to discuss the future of this initiative. In addition, there is a growing involvement of public authorities to the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve, seen as a cleaner, more responsible and lasting development model. To ensure the consistency and continuity of actions and to help create a fruitful environment for the sum of efforts, it is also important to have a solid backbone structure. Many advances have already been made, but the work has just begun. It's necessary to look at our protected areas as real drivers of development, especially through their implementation and better structuring. This is only possible with the support of society and the involvement of public authorities, reducing pressures, protecting the local fauna and flora, guaranteeing ecosystem services, and intensifying the fight against global climate change. We look forward that all these efforts can truly improve people's quality of life. The results obtained in recent years, even in very challenging times, give us hope that we are on the right track. We are convinced that with the local sum of efforts and the right national-international partnerships, the Atlantic Forest Great Reserve will become an inspiration for other territories in Brazil and in the world.
Thank you, Ricardo. And I know that you're following online. I'm very happy also to see how, we further explore Brazil with some very surprising lenses, thinking of the Amazon as an urbanizing area. But when we think of forests in Brazil, I would say 95% of the time it is about Amazonia, but the Brazil Atlantic forest is incredibly important, and we also need to look at regeneration and renewal and protection of these forests. And I think this was a great example of how to do regenerative, restorative work through networks that are inclusive. So we will stay in Brazil as Juliana Baladelli Ribeiro will join us to discuss a business case of nature-based climate action. Juliana is a nature-based solutions specialist at the Fundação Grupo Boticário and leads the nature-based cities agenda there. Juliana seeks to create and improve environmental public policies and sustainability and adaptation strategies. After Juliana's input, we will also have the opportunity to further discuss our Brazilian cases on the Atlantic Great Forest Reserve and the Viva con Agua initiatives with André Ferretti, who is a senior manager of biodiversity economics at the Boticário Group Foundation for Nature Protection. He brings a wealth of expertise in nature-based solutions, ecological restoration, payment for environmental services, protected areas, and environmental impact of businesses. Thank you for joining us also, André.
Olá, Sou a Juliana Ribeiro, representante da Fundação Grupo Boticário de Proteção à Natureza, uma instituição privada que há mais de 3 décadas trabalha pela conservação da biodiversidade brasileira. Somos mantidos pelo Grupo Boticário, uma das maiores empresas do setor de beleza do Brasil. Contribuímos com a conservação da natureza a partir da geração e disseminação de conhecimento, da articulação e influência em políticas públicas e da cocriação e implementação de soluções, atuando em 4 territórios prioritários e 3 agendas estratégicas em escala nacional, que são turismo em áreas naturais, oceano e cidades baseadas na natureza, que é o tema desta apresentação. O último relatório do IPCC traz dados alarmantes sobre os impactos da mudança do clima. Entre os riscos apontados estão enchentes, ondas de calor, secas, prejuízos à biodiversidade e à agricultura. As cidades são consideradas hotspots de ação climática. Ao mesmo tempo em que os riscos climáticos se sobrepõem no território urbano, também é nas cidades onde pode haver mais oportunidades para adaptação. Existe ainda uma janela para ações de adaptação, que está ficando cada vez mais estreita. As ações são urgentes, pois as decisões tomadas hoje determinam o nosso caminho futuro. As soluções baseadas na natureza são ações que usam processos e ecossistemas naturais para enfrentar os desafios mais urgentes do nosso tempo, como os impactos provocados por eventos climáticos extremos. Ou seja, por meio dos serviços ecossistêmicos oferecidos pela própria natureza, podemos superar os principais desafios da sociedade, entregando como resultado o bem-estar humano, benefícios para a biodiversidade, oportunidades econômicas e ainda ajudando a alcançar os Objetivos de Desenvolvimento Sustentável. As florestas são exemplos de SBN que atuam como filtros, possibilitando a oferta de água em quantidade e qualidade suficientes para garantir a segurança hídrica em suas 4 dimensões. Estas imagens de uma estação de tratamento de água mostram a importância das áreas naturais para a segurança hídrica. São registros com 2 dias de diferença, antes e depois de chuvas intensas. Na foto da direita é possível ver a turbidez da água após a chuva. Isso encarece o tratamento e, em casos extremos, provoca a suspensão do abastecimento. Ou seja, nem sempre muita chuva é sinônimo de disponibilidade hídrica. Esse exemplo reforça a importância das SBN. Elas atuam em escala de paisagem, ou seja, nem sempre impactam diretamente o local onde estão implementadas. A natureza no entorno das cidades exerce um papel de filtro, melhorando a qualidade dos recursos hídricos que abastecem os centros urbanos. Além disso, são áreas essenciais para a conservação da biodiversidade, formando uma malha verde que acompanha os recursos hídricos e interliga diferentes ecossistemas. Já as áreas naturais urbanas, como os parques lineares, têm um papel um pouco diferente. Podem agregar serviços ambientais referentes à regulação do microclima local, aumentam a permeabilidade do solo, reduzindo o risco de enchentes e enxurradas, e melhoram as condições ambientais das cidades de forma geral, garantindo maior contato da população com a natureza, que é tão importante para a nossa saúde e bem-estar. Entendemos que incorporar SBN em cidades é um desafio imenso, que necessita de cooperação e trabalho em rede. Por isso, a Fundação Grupo Boticário acredita tanto em atuar de forma conjunta com outras organizações, em busca de objetivos comuns. Assim, juntos, podemos otimizar recursos, compartilhar conhecimento, conexões e competências, e assim ganhar escala e ampliar benefícios. Nossa atuação se dá dessa forma, unindo os melhores a favor de um objetivo global. Nesse contexto, criamos a Aliança Bioconexão Urbana, com o objetivo de desenhar soluções compartilhadas que subsidiem políticas públicas e aumentem o investimento em SBN para tornar as cidades brasileiras mais resilientes aos impactos da mudança do clima. Como parceiros, temos algumas das principais instituições nacionais e internacionais que atuam com essa temática no Brasil. Um exemplo de ação conjunta da Aliança Bioconexão Urbana é o Acelerador de SBN em Cidades. Por meio dessa iniciativa, ajudamos as cidades a tirar ideias do papel, transformando-as em projetos de SBN com capacidade de financiamento, buscando assim ganhar escala na implementação de ações de SBN e viabilizando cada vez mais cidades baseadas na natureza. Além disso, promovemos engajamento por meio de nossas redes sociais e disseminamos conhecimento a partir de publicações técnicas, traduzidas para uma linguagem adequada ao público-alvo. A publicação Cidades Baseadas na Natureza traz o conceito de SBN com cases práticos e call to action para os setores público e privado. Acesse nossas redes sociais e conheça mais sobre o trabalho da Fundação Grupo Boticário de Proteção à Natureza.
Thank you, Juliana and Boticário Group Foundation, for showing the business case that business can be inclusive, regenerative, and delivering broadly across multiple sustainable development goals. Now that we have heard from our excellent panel, we have the opportunity to discuss with you how we can galvanize nature-based climate action. Also, if you join online, ask your questions on Twitter or Mastodon using the hashtag #NCGroundswell. James, you are the inaugural director of the Dahdaleh Institute for Global Health Research. So my question to you is, what is the cost of climate change impacts on human health, and how can it motivate climate action?
Thanks, Sander. I chose one example, famine in Somalia, to indicate the significant health impacts of climate change. But I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple impacts, multiple pathways of impact. It's not simply food insecurity. Rising temperature means changing humidity patterns, which also mean changing vector patterns, which means changing patterns of infectious disease. And so, for example, we see very significant increases in malaria, dengue fever, schistosomiasis, cholera, and so on, that are related to changing vector patterns and also related to changing quality of water. We also see major impacts of extreme weather events, whether they're flood, hurricane, fire, wildfire, and so on. These have immediate physical impacts on individuals, but also on communities, and then secondary impacts on health systems, and which mean then that people don't get to go to their clinic for their maternal child health checkup. They don't get to go to the hospital or the clinic for their necessary surgery, and so on. So there are immediate and then secondary impacts. And then the other, which I already highlighted, is food insecurity. This is probably the most significant, at least the most significant and the most remedial, and that's why I highlighted it. Food insecurity is increasing very, very significantly around the world. And already today there are 811 million people, so more than 10% of all human beings on the planet live in a state of extreme food insecurity, extreme precarity, extreme vulnerability. And that number is increasing. As crop yields fall, that number will become much more significant. And then finally, the impacts of changing ecosystems. So climate change alters ecosystems. In Africa, for example, there are 7, across the continent of Africa, there are 7 distinct ecosystems. Each of these are changing very, very significantly. And each of these, with the subsystems within them, those changes have very clear and very immediate health impacts. I think that kind of gives you an outline of how I think about the health impacts of climate change. I do want to say something about what we can do about these things. So at the Dahdaleh Institute, in partnership with MSF, with Red Cross, with many other organizations, we're developing very specific tools that can help communities adapt to the health impacts of climate change. And so, for example, we are in the process of developing, I don't want to say we've actually finished it, but we're in the process of developing a computer-based simulation model that uses agent-based modeling and systems dynamics modeling to define the various things that I've talked about in very particular locations, so that individual communities can run essentially scenarios, and then based on those scenarios, they can make choices about where they wish to put their energy in terms of choosing specific adaptations. The other one I'll just quickly mention is we've developed a whole series of tools that use artificial intelligence and machine learning and digital platforms to identify pathogenic contamination of water, which is a major, it's the most important issue when dealing with health concerns for refugees or internally displaced persons. Waterborne infectious disease accounts for about 56% of all mortality in humanitarian emergencies. So any kind of a tool that can help you identify the probability of an infectious disease outbreak, and then also tell you how much chlorine to put in your bucket if you're a mom going down to the river to get water, or how much chlorine to put in your 500,000 liter bladder tank if you're MSF or the Red Cross or OCHA providing humanitarian assistance in a particular setting. So there are health impacts, but I really want to emphasize, and this is why this discussion here today is so important. There are practical things that we can do to help individuals and communities adapt, and that nature-based solutions are really fundamental to this.
Thank you, James. Andrew, you sketched some sobering trends on cross-border climate actions. What can international organizations such as the CBD, but we're here at the Climate COP, the UNFCCC, what can they do to buck these trends? You can.
Thanks, Sander. What they can do is embed accountability into their action agendas. So intergovernmental organizations, as well as national governments, can support, orchestrate, organize these cross-border initiatives with accountability inside their governance structures. To give you a quick example, research published this year shows that initiatives with secretariats or staff and those with explicit monitoring arrangements perform higher than those without. However, as concerningly, initiatives launched in 2021, this is all of them, compared to those launched across time, only half of them have secretariats and accountability and explicit monitoring arrangements. This is cited in research. This is cited in a recent report we published with the New Climate Institute. So we know what it takes to have successful initiatives. We just need to implement those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I would like to turn to Bethan. So we saw that rewilding is one great example of how climate action can deliver both on health, nature, and climate action in cities. What holds cities back to do this more?
Thank you. Yeah, it's an excellent question, and there are many answers, but I'm just going to dive into the policy side because I think that's a major place where we can really push for some change. A lack of flexible policy in regarding to how we think about nature in urban spaces is a major factor that holds cities and countries back. So there's a need for policy innovation and awareness of the tools that are available to policymakers and city leaders in how they can build up resilience against climatic shocks and move towards bringing nature into urban spaces. In most countries, it's the case that when we think about environmental and biodiversity policy, it tends to emphasize the preservation of past environmental and ecological conditions, the sort of idea that it harkens back to ideas of how landscapes looked in the past and the acceptance that we should see them that way moving forward. However, in an era of climate change that we're in right now, it's not really viable to think about trying to keep these ecosystems as they were before we started to see the impacts of climate change. Some species are already being driven beyond their traditional ranges, and some ecosystems are being pushed way beyond their limits. So in such situations, restoring these historical conditions, particularly when we look at urban spaces, is simply not viable. We're not in a position where we can envision urban biodiversity with a view that we're still at pre-industrial levels of emissions. So we need to be thinking with a forward-looking lens. And I think for policymakers, the really important point is to emphasize the positive externalities and the co-benefits that come with initiatives like rewilding. You've got the emergence of new novel ecosystems that can succeed in these new climatic conditions. You've got lower costs. Rewilding is about the establishment of patches of nature that are self-regulating, self-reorganizing, and with minimal to no management. Now, that's not to say there's just because something is low management doesn't mean it's no management. So there is a required level of minimal management and some initial investment, but it's definitely a lower cost solution. There's also major public health benefits, which harkens off what you were just saying. By 2050, 2 out of every 3 people will live in cities. That's what the current estimates are saying. So as such, we need to be building our cities in the understanding they're going to see enormous population spikes in the next 30 years. And there's also going to be an immense amount of pressure from things like increased heating, increased levels of flooding, and rewilding is a tool that can be really effective in trying to minimize the urban heat bubble effect, minimize flooding and other climatic shocks. And as such, it represents a really effective resilience builder. And the final point on this is that it can be an emissions mitigation solution as well. Obviously, carbon sequestration through nature-based solutions is very effective, but it has to take place alongside and not in place of enormous levels of decarbonization and moving away from fossil fuels. This nature-based solutions cannot be seen as something we do instead of decarbonization. It has to be something that happens in tandem. So the final thing I'll say as I close is that something we need to be doing to help increase cities moving towards bringing nature into them is to equip policymakers and leaders with these tools, because they're ready and they're available to be used and taken up. It's just about spreading that scientific knowledge, embedding it, and introducing this slightly newer way of thinking which comes with the rewilding approach, because we need to move away from simply preserving historical benchmarks of how we think things should look, and towards enhancing ecosystem functionality in urban spaces, and with that seeing amazing levels of co-benefits to people and planet. So yeah, a long answer, but that's my answer.
Thank you, Bethan. So Deborah, nature-based climate action should be rights-based, but compared to the CBD space, the space around the conventional and biological diversity, my observation is that indigenous knowledge and peoples are not as well represented and as prominent in this space at the COP around the UNFCCC. Although I do see some changes, what can more be done to improve representation within the climate action space?
Thank you. This is a very important question. We've been seeing a lot of progress regarding representation since I've been following the process. Definitely the curve has grown. Sorry I didn't bring we have a table, we monitor that, and for example now we have the highest number. It's 280 delegates on this COP, and 250 came to the pre-COP. So it's significant in number, but it's also important in its composition. It's diversifying. There's younger people and there's women-led organizations, which we didn't had the chance to see before. So that's growing. But the positive side is that information is flowing on how to frame territorial changes and how to engage with non-territorial actors. And this is positive, but are we providing spaces to actually make the flow of tools such as the ones you were speaking about, or tools, I mean, or actually hearing indigenous people's knowledge about climate change properly, like their practices? It's still, I don't believe it's still, consolidated, but I feel we're going in a good path if we're open to do so. For me, from my perspective, for doing so, we need to have a meaningful representation, not only in numbers. And a key aspect could be to be less stereotyped. It's not that simple. Indigenous peoples and local communities do change. We know that, and adaptation is ongoing. So the knowledge, it is ancestral, but it's also very, very actual. It's present. So being here and being heard, it's important, but it should come with policies that include the flexibility, the adaptation that it's ongoing on the ground. And for example, there's ongoing interest in carbon markets on territorial areas. In the Amazon basin is huge. How do these engage with the adaptations and the local knowledge that it's ongoing now, presently, and not ancestral? These kind of questions should be posed, and the information could be flowing better. So that are some ideas.
Thank you, Deborah. Andre, thank you for being here. And yeah, we have just seen 2 examples of nature-based climate action, biodiversity protection, and engagement of also local people and organizations in Brazil. There's the Conexão Urbana Alliance, but also the Atlantic Forest. What conditions do you think are necessary to have a supportive environment for nature-based climate actions for resilient cities?
Nature-based solutions aim to enhance the creation of more sustainable and resilient cities. For this, it's necessary to join forces, aim at the high impact of the union of public power and the private initiative to generate scale in the transformations of cities, and as additional result to contain the current rates of loss of biodiversity and degradation of ecosystems. The capture of and the storage of atmospheric carbon through restoration and maintenance of natural areas is one of the best ways to keep the carbon stored, thus reducing the atmospheric concentration of this is important greenhouse gas and the impacts of the climate change. The dissemination of the concept and the cases of nature-based solutions, as well as the creation of support funds and credits for investments in green infrastructure, is essential to expand the use of this strategy for mitigating and adapting to climate change. The approach of nature-based solution can and should be considered in public policies related to health, security, development, energy efficient restoration and conservation of natural environments, among others. This is the most efficient way to promote necessary actions. Nature-based solution can be included in urban policies in a variety of ways, through mainstreaming existing sectoral policies, regulation of specific policies for stimulus, or even through economic incentives, like trading carbon credits, offsetting impacts on biodiversity, payments for ecosystem services. Another way to enable the implementation of nature-based solutions in urban areas is the integration of actions in urban infrastructure, such as roads, housing. The consideration of nature as part of the solution can make these projects bring additional benefits beyond those for which they were proposed, and therefore several funding agencies around the world are already requesting the inclusion of nature-based solutions as a counterpart of financing of urban infrastructure works. There is an urgent need for cities to develop plans to mitigate and adapt to climate change, involving all sectors of society, such as local government, companies, universities, residents, NGOs, and it is important to create discussion forums, identify the main vulnerabilities, and encourage the creation of solutions and development of specific public policies.
Thank you very much, Andre. Now it is the turn of the audience to ask questions, and I would invite questions from the audience. Let's collect a number of questions. Please, and if you ask a question, please state your name, your organization, and indicate who the question is for.
Good evening, Sophie Klein, Utrecht University, not far from you, and Sustainable Finance Lab. I'm researching on how to finance nature-based solutions in real estate. And I think we saw from your session that the values and the benefits are very clear for nature-based solutions, but they are somehow not in the equation for investors when we look at investments in cities or, more specifically in real estate. So I was wondering what you would suggest, how it can be clearer or how it can be shown in the balance sheet, like that was what I was told in another session, that it's nature-based solutions and the benefits, it doesn't show up there. And I was wondering how you identify kind of stakeholders and then also potential investors for nature-based solutions projects.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. Are there other questions?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ines Dombrowski from the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, IDOS. I have a question actually to Andrew and Sander on the database work. I mean, the data that you showed today were really a bit shocking, knowing that many initiatives didn't deliver and even withdrew recently. So can you maybe reflect a bit further on it in terms of what could be reasons for that? Also, you have also analyzed other climate actions. Is this a particular trend in nature-based solutions that you are seeing? And maybe it is also related to the data that you have so far. I mean, is there a chance that you might have overlooked stuff and that further research into this would give some more promising results? Yeah, that's a question to you. And maybe a question to all of those who promote and work on the NBS in cities. Can you tell us a bit more about the potential conflicts that might arise and maybe also how you deal with these? So I could imagine that some people are not so fond of having certain animals close to their houses and so on, and maybe tell us about this experience. Thanks.
Thank you both for your excellent questions. Might I add one question also coming in through Twitter? And it's from Julia. She says, I'm an environmental science grad student. It's great to see diverse non-ecology voices at the table. Why do you think it's so difficult for people to connect human health and planetary security dots? So maybe we can just give our panelists the opportunity to briefly respond to the questions. Can I start with you, James? Or anyone who wants.
I will try and remember the three questions. Firstly, on the real estate, really, really interesting point. Thank you for raising it. I mean, I'm a policy-focused individual, so my brain immediately goes to the policy space. But when we're thinking about how we can bring nature into real estate and urban spaces and just all new housing development, I think we need to be thinking about what are the regulatory and policy requirements in place to push direction and to push things in that direction. I can speak from a case in the UK where we've seen some interesting developments. In our new environmental legislation, we've seen something called the emergence of biodiversity net gain, which means that new developments, there will be a requirement for there to be a 10% increase of biodiversity net gain. Now, what that will mean in reality is yet to be worked out, and there's a lot of discussions going on across government. But it's been a really, as you know, from an academic institution and from a science institution, it's been really interesting to watch and attempt to engage with those conversations. Okay, so how are we measuring? What are the metrics for when we understand biodiversity in urban spaces and in spaces where humans are interacting? I think I would think the main point I would make, though, is that this has to be done in consultation with the communities in which they're living with, and also a remembrance that consultation is not consent as well, as to when we're thinking about, and I think it'd be good for others who work with indigenous communities to speak to this too. But when we're looking at changing humans' interaction with nature and bringing that into urban spaces, we need to remember we need to talk to the people too, and this can't be imposed upon people. It has to be done in a consultative, collaboratively shared, owned manner. And in our report, we recently wrote on this topic of rewilding urban spaces, we make this point that rewilding projects will fail if they do not have community buy-in. And there's an essential component of bringing communities to the center of those conversations in order for rewilding and nature-based solutions in general to be accepted, because people will develop an emotional, cultural connection to them, which will entail their longevity. So there's a few thoughts on that one. Do we want to go question by question? Or?
No, just react to any question you feel like.
My brain. Human-wildlife, the human-nature conflict question, very, very good. I'd encourage you to read the report. We have a whole chapter on this. But very, very good question. And it comes back to the solutions come back to what I just said. These to be in collaboration with the communities that we're working with. But there are conflicts that can be easily managed. Human-wildlife conflict is one of them. Now, when we talk about rewilding, we're not suggesting the reintroduction of wolves or bison into urban spaces. It's not quite like that. But it does mean a shift towards people having a slightly different relationship to how close they are to nature in their everyday lives. So there are a few risks there. There's also some risks of people, because they see an increased number of wildlife in their communities, feeling that they can release their own animals into the ecosystems, which can be quite detrimental for obvious reasons. But again, that comes down to communication and relationship with these communities to minimize that. And then there's also some minor disease risks as well. But again, that can be mitigated and worked through collaboration and putting science at the forefront and collaboration with communities on the ground. I can't remember the third question, I'm sorry. But does anyone else have any other thoughts?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just on the last question from the person on Twitter, the question of the issue of connecting health to planetary health or planetary security. Why is it so difficult to connect those dots? I think it really is really one of the most important global cultural challenges of our time, that we actually do connect those dots, and that we make every effort to help people realize the relationship that we exist in. Our existence emerges from nature. It is dependent on nature. It is not separate from nature. I think the success of the last 500 years of human history, the post-Enlightenment period, is predicated on some, I think, flaws in how we think and act as human beings. This fundamental idea that we have dominion over nature and that we are separate from it is a deeply flawed idea. And it has manifestations that we have just lived through as a global community. COVID emerged because of human interaction with other species in a manner that is conducive to zoonotic disease, to the transmission of disease from one species to another. 70% of all new infectious diseases are zoonotic diseases. And one of the things that we're doing at the Dahdaleh Institute is we have a major program on a One Health approach to the emergence of antimicrobial resistance. And this really is focused on exploring in very clear terms the science of antimicrobial drug resistance, or how that actually happens, what's the genetics of that, and then also focusing on governance, human governance, and so ways of interacting, ways of making decisions in a context where as human beings globally, we do not have a global government, and yet we do have a need for global action around antimicrobial drug resistance. So what governance mechanisms, what ways of interacting, what ways of engaging policy questions, what ways of engaging communities are actually effective in achieving the kind of results that we seek around antimicrobial drug resistance. And then I would also just say finally that in answer to the question, in Malawi, we have a research program where we are modeling the health impacts of climate change. And that program very clearly indicates and is based now on nature-based solutions that minimize human health impacts of climate change. And so, for example, reducing eutrophication of water has major impacts on the incidence and prevalence of cholera and schistosomiasis. Particular irrigation practices for crops have very significant impacts on the incidence and prevalence of schistosomiasis. But one of the things that we've learned that's really, really important is that nature-based solutions must be coupled with solutions to people's basic needs. So people in, for example, the Chilwa Basin, who are suffering from schistosomiasis, who are suffering from cholera, who are suffering from malaria, before they can engage in nature-based solutions, they need to have treatment for schistosomiasis, treatment for cholera, treatment for malaria. And once those basic services are provided, then people are very willing. And in fact, their traditional practices are such that they're very open to nature-based solutions. So this kind of relationship, recognizing the relationship between human health and biospheric health, this is planetary health. And building the interdigitations of both human health and biospheric health, I think this is a way to move forward and to, as the questioner put it, connect the dots.
Thank you, James. And maybe you had one short?
I had one further point on the health side, if that. In an urban context, as I said earlier, 2 out of every 3 people are going to live in cities by 2050. One of the major threats is going to be heat because of the increasing effects of climate change. We need to build our urban spaces in an understanding that we're going to be struggling with incredible heat waves. I mean, Europe's just seen an enormous one this summer. But it's not, and rewilding and bringing nature into urban spaces can be a very effective heat mitigation tool. It can physically lower temperatures by many degrees, and has been proven to have some really positive impacts on tackling the urban heat bubble effect. So just wanted to raise that as another vital tool for public health. And the same goes for air pollution as well. As we see more populations in urban spaces, air pollution is going to become more of an issue. Hopefully it will become better as we decarbonize and move towards electric vehicles and move away from fossil fuels. But at the moment, it's estimated that 1 in 5 deaths every year are caused by air pollution. And in urban spaces, that's obviously still a major, major issue. So if nature can be a tool, a public health tool in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethan. And just very briefly on the question about the shocking results that we see from our analysis at the moment, they are not specific to nature-based solutions. We see it across climate action, and this is very, very worrying. If I look around at this COP, like we see more and more initiatives being presented, but we hear very little about how they are doing, the initiatives that have been launched like a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So the COP is a grand stage for these initiatives to come up with great promises. And we really, really need to hold these non-state actors accountable. What we see, and this is something I haven't seen before in our research, is that all indicators are showing us that initiatives are not delivering what they promise, that they are not meeting the needs of those that need climate action the most, that need to that benefit from climate action the most. We also see that initiatives are increasingly not kind of minimally productive to have any impact on positive impact on environmental and social indicators. So what we are seeing is potentially a great greenwash, where we have, initially we thought we would rely more on non-state and subnational actors because governments are not coming through. Now, unfortunately, we have more and more evidence that non-state and subnational actors are also not coming through sufficiently to address the challenges that we see. And this is especially important for nature-based solutions because this space is kind of fragmented between a climate space and a biodiversity kind of negotiation space. And it is these initiatives that actually bring them together, but how is the question. So I would like to round up this panel with a question to our panel. No, not a question. So as we close, I would like to ask every panelist to finalize this sentence in 20 seconds. By next year's COP, I would like to see. Maybe I can start with you, Andrew.
Thanks, Sander. I'd like to see by next COP greater accountability in the climate and biodiversity agendas, including by all actors, national governments, cities, regions, businesses, and civil society. Focused, we want to see more standards and more tracking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just literally making this up on the fly, but by the next COP, I would like to see much more examples of successful planetary health initiatives that recognize and incorporate the health of human beings as dependent on the health of the biosphere. I think this is imminently possible. But the separation of these two domains is not good and is unhealthy, and I would like us to move more clearly in that direction.
Thank you. In just a few weeks' time, the world leaders and governments will meet again in Montreal, in Canada, for the Convention on Biological Diversity and hopefully the passage of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So by this time next year, I would love to see us in a position where we've got a strong, ambitious, hopefully legally binding Global Biodiversity Framework. And by the time we reach COP28 next year for the UNFCCC, some real breaking down of those silos between the way we understand biodiversity as it relates to climate change and vice versa. Because in implementation, these things are inherently connected, and the Rio conventions that guide them keep it pretty siloed. So I'd love to see us in a position where we're starting to break down those silos and really starting to think about biodiversity and climate change solutions in a holistic manner.
Yeah, what I would like to see is a meaningful representation of communities, meaning not only that they're on the table, but they're actually heard. And by that, we need a multi-scalar intervention that needs more tracking on rights. So I totally share your observations, Sander, on how initiatives are lacking of tracking and indicators, and this should be always stressed. So meaningful representation.
Andre, 20 seconds, sorry.
I'd like to see much more ambition and a strong decision about adaptation, highlighting nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Andre. So I would like to thank all panelists here and our co-hosts. Our panel comes at a crucial moment. In a few weeks, indeed, we have COP15 on biodiversity in Montreal, and there is no better time to connect action for health, nature, and climate under one action agenda. And by next year's COP, I would like to see a strong action agenda that unleashes the power of nature and community for a safe and healthy climate for all that engages all of us. Thank you.